So I am assuming that the majority of folks will come back on screen. Is that what normally happens or not?
Sometimes, not all the time.
All right,
Not
well,
always so.
I'll wait a minute and then I'll start in.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so hi everybody again, good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about mindfulness, a topic that all of us, I'm sure we're familiar with, or we think we're familiar with. So that's always dangerous, to be making assumptions. And so I think it's really helpful to go back and visit fundamentals from time to time. And that's what I would like to do tonight. And hopefully I time this right. So I'd like to make this really practical because I want to talk about the nature of mindfulness and then apply it to the experience I had getting my COVID booster shot. And then do some discussion. Okay. So I think with Buddhist mindfulness, as opposed to the kind of popularized mindfulness that we're seeing all across our culture at the moment, what's important to remember is that the methods, the teachings, and the psychology of the historical Buddha are all completely integrated. They're all purposeful and relate to each other. So what we see culturally is people taking what they think is mindfulness and then certain qualities that they believe are associated with mindfulness and putting those together in a package. Frequently, that ends up leaving something out or emphasizing what's there in a way that, at least from a Buddhist perspective, is misleading or is not very helpful. So I want to go all the way back to the basics. And for me, the starting place is that there's a difference between the role that mindfulness can play and what mindfulness is. That said that okay. So there's a difference between the functions, the roles that mindfulness can play, and mindfulness itself, what it is as kind of an operating system that all the other methods, teachings, and psychology are dependent on or rest on. And for those in the group who are kind of scholars of this, there's frequently a breaking down of the different activities. So the idea is, well, there's mindfulness, and combined with another state of mind allows that to be a function. So I want to be really clear that the things that I'm about to talk about are actually the historical Buddhist descriptions of mindfulness, not mindfulness plus something. And this emphasizes for me that mindfulness can play different roles. So one role that's really associated historically with the definition is a remembering function. So it's the process of the mind actually recalls to be mindful in the moment, which, is always kind of this spectacular experience, that you'll be kind of caught in something, identified with it, having trouble with it, and then just all of a sudden, the mind will remember to be mindful. So that's actually a function of mindfulness itself. Another illustration of that would be is that in times when it's needed to recall inspiration. So the most common one, particularly in the East, is recalling the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, all the positive qualities of the three jewels, and allowing that to bring the energy and the inspiration up in the body and the mind so that you can practice. So one is a remembering function. Another one is kind of a gatekeeper function. For those of you who are familiar with the 7 factors of awakening, there are a set of factors which are bring the energy up in your body and your mind, and there's others which concentrate and stabilize and sharpen the mind. But they have to be in a particular balance. And if one has stronger presence than another one, then the entire thing doesn't work properly. Your ability to investigate or your ability to be equanimous becomes much more difficult. Mindfulness is like a gatekeeper over those 6 factors of mind. This is the Buddha's description. Another one is, and this is with respect to constructive and non-constructive states of mind, is that mindfulness actually acts as a guardian, watching over the quality and the implications of the thoughts that are taking place, and shepherding which way the mind is being pointed. You know, there's a very famous sutta on that about the 2 types of thought. And then another function is the idea that mindfulness or full awareness is actually the operating system that everything else sits on. So, you know, there's like 40 different meditation techniques in the Satipatthana Sutra. All of them are operating on the notion that the mind is fully present, awake, engaged, and knows what experience is taking place. In other words, is that it's mindful. So I want to focus particularly tonight on the notion of moment to moment or momentary awareness, which is at the core of any definition that you see in any tradition of Buddhism. And so the question for me is, well, why momentary or moment to moment? Where does that come from? And this for me is demonstrative of how everything fits together. And where it comes from is the historical Buddha's most fundamental notion of human consciousness. And that is that human consciousness arises through the contact of any one of our sense doors, hearing, seeing, touching, feeling, the mind itself, with an object that is receptive to that sense door. And at that moment, a sense of awareness or consciousness arises, so that like right now, if I move my hand, your eye follows that, and there are moments of contact and sight consciousness is arising. When I'm speaking, there's a pause. There is no sound consciousness in relationship to my voice. I begin speaking, there's contact with your eardrum, and if there's a functional eardrum, hearing consciousness arises. So this is the most fundamental starting place of all Buddhist teachings and Buddhist psychology, which is a psychology of causation. How does consciousness arise? And then what do we do with it? Okay. The key to this is that from a Buddhist perspective, this consciousness is arising on a moment-to-moment basis. It is not continuous. So that if I'm listening and suddenly my attention moves to a pain in my knee, in that moment, there is sensation consciousness in my knee, but there is not hearing consciousness, because the mind can't hold both of those at the same time. It can only hold one thing. So the underlying theory of consciousness is consciousness arises one moment at a time, one thing at a time. Now, it may be happening incredibly quickly, and the mind can get quite refined and see this extraordinary capacity of the mind to be experiencing things one after another. But the actual act of is taking place, and where mindfulness is pointing, is to the fact that in each moment something is arising, and it is one thing only. Okay, so and this isn't a rhetorical question. I'm actually asking these questions. So in the Satipatthana Sutra, which is the sutta on the establishment of mindfulness, Does anybody want to take a venture guess as to what is the most repeated recommendation of the historical Buddha of what to watch for and experience? Now, there's 40 different methods, but what is the Buddha's recommendation in relationship to this notion of momentary awareness that is repeated over and over and over again in the Satipatthana Sutra? Does anybody have a guess? So the most repeated refrain and recommendation is that we should watch for the beginning of an experience, the middle of it, how it's sustained, and its moment of ending. And this is repeated throughout the entire Satipatthana Sutra, and the Buddha's advice is that applies to every method, every object of meditation. So whether it's a sensation, a mind state, a dharma, a mood, an emotion, that we should be seeing its arising, it being sustained, and it disappearing. So the important part about this is that this whole discussion that I've just laid out is all before the cognitive mind begins to think and do anything with experience. Now, we all know that the mind has this extraordinary function that's quite close to the moment of consciousness arising, where it identifies something, it categorizes it, it labels it. And it does that so we are oriented to the world and can make sense of the world. And so the first and most fundamental meaning of mindfulness is what takes place before that cognitive process starts to take place. This is what the historical Buddha called direct experience. And it is from direct experience that insight arises. So insight meditation, vipassana, is not a cognitive insight process. It is a direct experience process that leads to pre-verbal, pre-thought insight. This is what liberates the mind. Okay. So what you have is that the Buddhist theory of consciousness is moment to moment, one thing at a time, and now you're taking a particular form of attention and applying it to the nature of consciousness. So there's a matching of how we're paying attention to the nature, the underlying nature of experience itself. This is the fundamental idea of mindfulness. So one way to think of mindfulness is that it is a snapshot of what's taking place, and it's a snapshot after a snapshot after a snapshot. We're seeing and experiencing one moment at a time after another. And as I say, it can be happening really quickly, but you can see the beginning of the breath. And you can see that there is a middle of the breath, and you can see that the breath ends. You can see that an emotion arises, and there is a duration of the emotion, and you can see the moment that it ends. Same with a sensation, same with a thought. But the key here is that we're paying full attention on that, and we are not adding anything. We're not subtracting anything. We're not modifying anything. We're not managing. We're not controlling. We're not making a judgment about it. We're not evaluating it. We're not making a choice about it. And we're not making a story or a narrative about it. And we're not pointing the mind to something or redirecting the mind to something. And so this is the reason that you'll hear mindfulness referred to as, quote, bare attention, meaning that nothing is being added to the experience, because that's the whole purpose of mindfulness, is actually to see the experience that is actually taking place not what we normally add on to it. You know, our thoughts, our assessments, our conclusions, our emotional reactions. And if we do this, I mean, if we can have these moments where the mind relaxes and we're just present, what happens is that there is a simplicity and there is just a clarity and there's a sense of ease. And that's the real mark of powerful mindfulness, is that we're just very clearly seeing, we're completely present. It is, we're not making effort to do it. It is effortless. It is easeful. And there's simplicity because we're seeing one thing at a time after another. So why would that be important? Two reasons. The first one is that the underlying function of mindfulness and Buddhist practice is actually to see things exactly as they are, rather than through our assumptions, our conclusions, our projections, through our emotional reactions. That we're actually getting down to the experience itself. And then if we can do that from a Buddhist perspective, the second thing that happens is that the mind can rest and it can begin to deeply understand whatever that is on an experiential precognitive level. So once that happens, if I can really pay attention to, for example, the anchor right here, and I'm there, there's a simplicity to that. And then if a thought intervenes, I can see that a thought is intervening, one thing at a time. And then I can see that that thought disrupts the continuity of the awareness. And depending on what it is, sends the mind off into an emotional reaction. But I'm not identifying with it because of the clarity and simplicity and the presence of the mind. I can start to see relationships between events, between thoughts, emotions, reactions, without identifying with them. So that I see things are, you know, a thought is not a fact. An emotional reaction is not a reality. That those are added on to the actual experience that's taking place. And then there's just a whole series of things that flow from there. And eventually, you know, the three core notions that underline almost all Buddhist practice of seeing deeply, experientially into the nature of suffering, into the nature of change, and into the absence of any continuing permanent sense of self that's controlling all of that. So without the mind being all the way back to where we said we started, without the mind being present, without adding anything on, without modifying it, without trying to manage or control it, we can't get to these other factors. And specifically, we can't get to insight. And it's insight which liberates the mind. So I'd like to use, here, I think I've got 5 minutes, so I can do that. I'd like to use my, to show that this is practical, not theoretical. I want to talk about my experience with my recent third shot, my COVID shot, my booster shot. And I've heard a lot of stories about that. You know, my first two shots, I just didn't have any reaction at all. Well, the second one, I was a little tired. This one, I got the shot on Thursday afternoon and almost immediately started having all kinds of symptoms and had all this pressure in my head and in my eyes. And, you know, if you weren't watching closely, you would think like, well, gee, maybe I'm getting a sinus headache. That's what it kind of felt like. It was like all up in here and here. But if you just sat with that, in other words, you know, being mindful, it's like, no, that is not in my sinuses. Something else is going on. And so there was all this pressure in my head. I didn't get a headache, but a lot of pressure. And then I started getting really tired. And I went home and I turned on the TV. I fell asleep watching the TV, which I never do. And so I went to bed early. thinking, okay, I'll get up the next morning, everything will be great. I get up the next morning, and my reaction was like, I wonder if I can even get out of bed. I mean, this thing really, really kicked my butt. I couldn't believe it. And so I get up, and I had planned, one of the things I really enjoy working out is I have a road bike, with the thin tires and the drop down bars. And it's just a joy for me to get on that and go out on the river and go for a long ride. And I had that scheduled for that morning. So I get up and I'm feeling this tiredness, and, my mind is going into, oh my gosh, you're so exhausted. There's no way you're going to be able to go on your ride. And if you go on your ride, you're going to get, miles out there, and then it's going to be hard to come back. And then it's going to take a day and a half to recover. So this whole kind of narrative is going on. And I noticed that my mind is procrastinating and then coming up with every rationalization not to work out. Okay. So using this, I said, okay, I'm just going to sit down on the couch and close my eyes. And okay, so like, what is actually taking place right now? What is the thing itself, not all this other stuff that's happening. So first thing was, I looked at the energy in my body, and I really sat with it. And what I could see almost immediately was that while the energy was very low, it didn't have any of the characteristics of being exhausted. Like I had overexerted myself and now I was exhausted. There wasn't any of that. It was just, well, there's low energy in my body. So, my first reaction to that is, well, what is the story about? This whole drama about, oh, I can't do that. And no, I've just got low energy in my body right now. Okay, so what else so I look at my mind, and I see that my mind, the energy in my mind is really slow. And because it's slow, it's kind of foggy and it's confused as to what's going on. I mean, that's actually the quality of the mind. It's like, it's kind of going like, what the hell's going on here? So, but it's really clear that what's happening in the mind is that the mind is unclear about what's happening. So then I said, well, what states of mind are happening? And I noticed that I felt very anxious, which I hadn't realized before. And when I looked at that, it was all being generated by a narrative or a story that my mind was creating. It's like, oh my gosh, you took this COVID shot and everybody says it just kicks their butt, and now it's kicking your butt. And, it's going to get worse. And like, maybe what you should do is like, just take a nap now, even though you've only been out of bed for an hour and a half, and just go back to bed, in fact. Yeah. So does this sound familiar at all? Does your mind do this? Whenever I do this kind of disclosure, I always wonder, gee, I wonder if I'm disclosing too much. But this was a real moment for me. And this goes back to mindfulness, is that I could really hang on to the reality that this was just a state of low energy, so that the whole narrative that was being created was nothing more than that. It was just a story. It didn't have anything at all to do with the condition of my body. So I can't use that as a basis for making decisions. So I just sat with that and just stayed with the energy, and pretty soon the whole story just starts to subside, dissipate, and the whole story just disappears. There's no longer any story. As the story disappears, there's no longer any anxiety in my body. And what I'm left with is low energy. Okay, so what do I do now? I said, I want to get on my bike. I want to work out, and I'll be really mindful. Like I'll watch the cadence, because I bike long enough and I have a speedometer on there that I can tell what I'm capable of based on that cadence and the speed. So I said, well, I'll just watch that. So there's no issue at all if I'm going to, overexhaust myself, hurt myself, get stuck out there. And so I decided to go for a ride. This is an illustration of mindfulness helping us make wise and compassionate choices. Get on my bike, just had a great morning. It was slow. It was a lot slower, I'll tell you, than I normally go, but really enjoyable because it was so clear about what I was doing, and I was able just to drop into the experience in my body, almost no thought at all. Came back, felt very energized, even though I still felt low energy the rest of the day, but my mind was bright and it affected my whole day. So this is to me how these two things fit together. You know, at the beginning, it starts off like, oh my gosh, consciousness and moment to moment consciousness. And well, there it is. I mean, like that moment, a willingness to really sit with and not jump to any conclusions, not make a speculation about the energetic quality in my body and really see it clearly that all it was a low level of energy and there weren't any other symptoms, none. Then that sets the stage for evaluating everything else. Without that willingness to be there moment, seeing it arise, continue, disappear. Yet very, very clear, all it is low energy, then I've got a basis for making a wise decision in my life. So that's for me how the theory and the practice fits together. And my belief is, and this is really not just a belief, it's tested in my life, that at least in my practice, there isn't a difference between theory and practice. If that's the way it feels, it means that we are still working on a conceptual model and haven't integrated it and made it into an experiential model for ourselves. And that's the key step. You know, it's frequently the step between being a book Buddhist and a practicing Buddhist. It's ideas and thoughts and concepts versus experience. So there's this whole trial and error thing between the two models. Okay, so I think we've got, let's see here. We've got maybe 10 minutes for some comments, questions, thoughts, objections, arguments. And so that can be about mindfulness. It could be about anything in the sitting, about the touch points, beginning, middle, and end, or about the opening little clip about the gorilla. So whatever seems to be up for you guys.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When in this particular process or another process, when you're using bare attention, how do you choose whether you're going to be paying attention to your thought? In this particular instance, you paid attention to your body and your low energy, or to a sensation. So how do you choose what is the most important, significant thing to look at?
Yes.
And pay attention?
Okay. So that's a that seems like a simple question.
No, I don't think it is.
No, I mean that's like maybe a whole retreat's worth of talks.
Okay.
But I'll take a shot at it, okay? And just as a gentle clarification, you know, what we're talking about in mindfulness is awareness itself.
Yes.
As opposed to attention. Attention is, your question is, where do we direct
Yes.
our attention? Where do we take the mindfulness, okay? So the starting place is, you know, if you think about it as mindfulness being an operating system,
Yes.
that's kind of the starting place, because we've got to have this quality of mind, which is engaging experience, but not trying to manage it or control it. That's an ego function. Now, that's important and it's legitimate, but it only happens later. And the reason we do this, well, no evaluation, you know, no judgment, no this, is that unless we bring that quality, we can't actually see clearly what is taking place. And so in the illustration I used, if I went to thought first, I would have just got lost in this narrative drama of, oh my gosh, I'm having a reaction to the COVID shot. And I've had friends who have had reactions. And so I'm lost in the narrative.
Right.
So we've got to, the whole purpose of all these practices first is to dive under the narrative to get a foothold. Okay. So in my own practice is to go to the body first.
Okay.
And the reason I do that is that historically, and I believe that this is the advice of the historical Buddha as well, it is the most reliable.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in a sutta called the Honeyball Sutta, and it's called the Honeyball Sutta because for those of you who've been to India, there's this little treat that the vendors sell, and it's a little ball. Let's see, and it's called a honey ball. And so I forget, I don't know if it's oats or something in it, but it's all honey. So when you pick it up, it's very sticky. Okay, so it tells you where the sutta is going. And the Buddha says that the mind's defense against experiencing what's taking place in the body is to move the attention from the body into thought and to personalize it, identification, to go into the narrative, and then you're lost.
Yes.
So that little sutta, it's not very long, but for me, it's always been seminal because he's saying, if that's the problem, is that the tendency is to immediately make a story, conceptualize everything. And, in our language, that you move into attachment and identification. And as we all know, once you're there, you're just lost, you're suffering, right? So my experience, and I believe that the core teachings are, if you start with the body first, that you have the best chance to then get everything else in perspective. Now, eventually, as from my illustration, you've got to consider it all, right?
Yes.
Because you're having an emotional reaction, you're having a thought reaction. But unless you get stabilized first, the emotion will take you away and put you into personalization, or the thought will take you away and put you in personalization. And then it kind of becomes an art form because, we learn that, well, we have certain habits, and that when somebody does this, my tendency is to do that. And what's the best way in this model that we're talking about to deal with that specific reactive pattern? And so then we all have to figure out, well, how do we individualize these general methods to our specific psychological, emotional body history and personality. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Maybe
you.
I know I'm supposed to speak here next month, so maybe that's the next talk. Maybe elaborating on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, your story, what you're describing sounds to me very much like you're being in an equanimous state, sort of staying in the center of your experience and not getting sucked out of that, right at the center of experience.
I would say that I eventually got there. But this is the fascinating thing, we kind of have, I think we have all these romantic ideas about practice. And it's like, well, if I can just get equanimous, then I'll figure everything out. Well, the trick is, how do I get there? And so in that illustration, the body became the anchor, right? The attention was fully there. not only no need to manage or control it, but understanding that staying there and fully experiencing and actually understanding experientially what was taking place, that's the motivation, the intention. That's the answer to everything else. So once that insight happens, like, wow, the only thing that's happening here is low energy, then the mind starts to rest. All of the crazy thoughts about, oh my gosh, maybe I'm having, this is happening, that's happening. It starts to settle. And then you work through the kind of experiential investigation process. And that process is what takes the mind into equanimity. It's a process of calming and stabilizing and clarifying the situation, and then the mind gets to equanimity. So sometimes your mind will just be really equanimous. We'll be practicing and boom, there it is. But most of the time, at least my experience is, that's not the way I get there. I get there through the process, and that's what the 7 factors of awakening are. It's the effort, investigation, and joy arising through those, and then concentration, tranquility, and equanimity. And mindfulness is kind of modulating those 6 factors. So that chart has always been, that configuration has been helpful to me, because it's just so clear that none of those are like permanent or even semi-permanent qualities of mind, that all of those together create a process, and they're each dependent on the other. So, okay, so I think we're kind of out of time, right? I should do a little bit of metta. And okay, so let's just do a very quick metta and offering of merit. Okay, so just allow your eyes to gently close for a minute. There have been a lot of ideas and thoughts, and see if we can just come back into the body and the breath and allow everything to settle. And may each of us and all beings everywhere be safe and protected, and be able to care for themselves and find some true measure of ease in their life. And may all beings be free from suffering. And may the value and the merit of our good intentions and our effort tonight spread out into the world and nourish all beings, human beings and other beings, and nourish the natural world. And in particular, in this particular time, may our good intentions and our efforts nourish our teacher and our dear friend, John Travis. So, thank you.